Most people remember Dunkirk as a story of survival. But what if survival was never supposed to happen? Christopher Nolan's film opens with silence, tension, and the sound of distant gunfire echoing through empty streets. It feels immediate, urgent, almost suffocating. But even that cinematic portrayal cannot fully capture the truth. Because the real story of Dunkirk does not begin with heroism. It begins with collapse. In May of 1940, the world watched as the unthinkable unfolded almost quietly. France, one of Europe's most powerful military forces, was not slowly retreating, it was disintegrating. The German advance was not merely fast, it was psychologically destabilizing. Entire Allied defensive strategies unraveled in days, not months. Communications failed. Command structures fractured. Units moved without knowing who was giving orders, or whether anyone still could. This was not a controlled withdrawal. It was a rupture, and in the middle of that rupture, more than 400,000 Allied soldiers were pushed north, compressed like debris before a tidal wave, toward the sea. They did not retreat by choice. They were funneled. British, French, Belgian, and Canadian troops poured toward the French coastal town of Dunkirk, not because it offered safety, but because it was the only direction not yet sealed by German armor. Roads became arteries of panic, clogged with exhausted men on foot, abandoned trucks, overturned artillery pieces, and equipment left behind because survival was suddenly more valuable than firepower. Air superiority had already been lost. Supply lines evaporated. Orders contradicted one another, or arrived too late to matter. By the time the soldiers reached the coast, many no longer believed evacuation was possible. They believed Dunkirk would be their grave. Geography alone seemed to confirm that fear. Dunkirk was not a fortified evacuation point prepared for mass extraction. It was a shallow coastline lined with long, exposed beaches. Large naval destroyers could not safely approach the sandbanks. The harbor infrastructure was limited, fragile, insufficient for the scale of what was needed, and the enemy was closing in. From the sky, German aircraft had an unobstructed view of everything. From the ground, the soldiers had nowhere to hide. From the sea, uncertainty loomed larger than hope. Men formed silent columns that stretched for miles along the beaches, not charging, not fighting, just waiting. Waiting for ships that might never come. Waiting under the constant possibility of air attack. Waiting with the understanding that if German ground forces reached the shoreline first, surrender or annihilation would follow. This was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no clear front lines anymore. No dramatic offensives. The soldiers at Dunkirk were not trying to win. They were trying to exist long enough to escape. Inside British command, the reality was grim. Initial calculations suggested that perhaps 30,000 men could be rescued, at best. Even that number felt optimistic. The Royal Navy was already stretched thin across multiple theaters of war. Sending large warships into the shallow waters off Dunkirk risked catastrophic losses. And losing those ships would not just weaken Britain, it would expose it. Because if the British Expeditionary Force was destroyed or captured, Britain would lose more than soldiers. It would lose its experienced corps, the very men needed to defend the island if Germany attempted invasion. Dunkirk was not just a military emergency. It was an existential one. This is the image the film Dunkirk captures so powerfully. The endless beach, the waiting men, the relentless attacks from above. But what cinema cannot fully portray is the internal landscape, the psychological state of those trapped between sea and enemy. These were not heroes anticipating a glorious rescue. They were exhausted, disoriented, afraid. Many had not slept properly in days. Food supplies dwindled. Water was rationed. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Some whispered that the Navy had already abandoned them. Others believed evacuation was a myth, a narrative constructed to maintain order before inevitable surrender. Hope did not disappear, but it thinned, and still they stood in line. What the film also cannot show is how close Britain came to accepting that Dunkirk might already be lost. Behind closed doors, discussions unfolded that the men on the beaches would never hear. Calculations were made with brutal clarity. How many ships could be risked? How many men could realistically be saved? How much could Britain afford to lose and still survive? This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic under pressure. Winston Churchill himself wrestled with the possibility that evacuation might fail. Contingency plans were quietly drafted for a scenario in which most of the army would be captured or killed. Britain prepared for the worst, even as it projected resolve to the world. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation plan, was born not from confidence, but from desperation. It depended on speed, improvisation, and luck. Three elements no military doctrine ever wants to rely on. And luck, in war, is never evenly distributed. As German forces tightened their perimeter around Dunkirk, something unexpected happened. The German armored divisions, which could have crushed the trapped forces, slowed. Orders were issued to halt their advance temporarily. Historians would debate the reasons for decades: overconfidence, logistical strain, strategic recalculation, even internal disagreements within German command. For the men on the beaches, none of those theories mattered. All they knew was this: the enemy had not yet arrived. And for the first time in days, time existed. It was within that fragile window that everything began to shift. Not because a brilliant master plan suddenly emerged, but because enough things went right, almost by accident. The sea, which could have turned violent, remained unusually calm. The weather, unpredictable and dangerous, offered brief moments of cover, and beyond the horizon, civilian vessels, small boats never designed for war, would soon play a role no strategist had envisioned. But at that moment, standing on the sand, none of it was guaranteed. There were no promises, no certainty, no assurance that help was truly coming. The soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk did not believe they were about to become symbols of resilience. They believed they were witnessing the end of an army, and history, balanced on shifting sand and shallow water, was waiting to decide whether Dunkirk would become a miracle of survival, or the place where hope drowned in plain sight. Operation Dynamo did not begin with confidence. It began with doubt. When the evacuation order was finally issued, it was framed not as a rescue of an army, but as an attempt to salvage fragments of one. No one inside British command believed that all 400,000 men could be saved. The objective was narrower, more restrained. Save who you can, while you still can. The Royal Navy did not possess the ships, the time, or the tactical advantage required for a conventional withdrawal under enemy pressure. The beaches were fully exposed. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Every movement toward the coastline invited bombardment. And yet, there was no alternative left to consider. Naval planners worked without pause. Routes were redrawn, tides recalculated, fuel consumption estimated down to the hour. Officers calculated loading times under fire. How many men per minute? How many minutes before the next air raid? Early projections were bleak. If everything went perfectly, a dangerous assumption in war, perhaps a fraction of the trapped force could be evacuated before the German perimeter collapsed. But war does not reward perfection, and everything did not go right. The harbor at Dunkirk was quickly rendered unusable. Bombing raids shattered docks and infrastructure, transforming the port into twisted metal and burning debris. Large destroyers, designed for open water combat, could not safely approach the shallow shoreline. Sandbanks and shifting tides forced ships to anchor offshore, which meant the soldiers had to reach them on foot. Men waded hundreds of meters through cold water, carrying rifles above their heads, packs weighing them down. bullets cutting into the sea around them. Some slipped. Some were pulled under by suction from departing vessels. Some drowned before ever touching a boat. Others were killed waiting their turn. And still, the evacuation continued. What changed the equation was not superior planning. It was improvisation on a national scale. Faced with the reality that military vessels alone could not extract the army, the British government made a decision unprecedented in modern warfare. Civilian boats would be requisitioned, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, ferries, tugboats, lifeboats, river steamers. Anything that could float and cross the channel was suddenly drafted into history. Some were commandeered and piloted by naval crews. Others were sailed by civilians themselves, men who were not under orders, not enlisted, not trained for combat, but who answered an unspoken call. Many of them did not fully understand what awaited them. They knew Dunkirk was dangerous. They did not know it was apocalyptic. The English Channel transformed into a corridor of chaos. Smoke obscured the horizon. Oil slicks burned on the surface of the water. Aircraft roared overhead. Ships maneuvered through wreckage and bodies. The line between combatant and civilian disappeared. Every vessel was now a target. In Dunkirk, the small boats are portrayed as symbols of unity and defiance, and they were. But what the film cannot fully communicate is how fragile their presence truly was. These were not armored ships. They were wooden hulls and thin steel frames facing dive bombers. One direct hit was enough. For the soldiers on the beaches, the arrival of small boats triggered conflicting emotions. Relief, because rescue was now visible. Terror, because boarding them was slow, exposed, and often lethal. Each trip across the channel carried only a handful of men. Thousands remained behind. Every departure forced others to stay standing in line, watching hope drift back toward England without them. Discipline became the thin barrier between order and catastrophe. Officers maintained lines with minimal force. Panic was suppressed, not through inspiration, but through exhaustion. The men were too drained to riot, too aware that chaos would doom them all. They moved when instructed. They waited when instructed. They watched ships explode and remained in formation. The film captures the scale, but scale alone does not reveal fragility. One shift in weather could have ended everything. One sustained bombing campaign could have annihilated the evacuation fleet. One uncontrolled surge of panic could have crushed hundreds before a single German soldier reached the sand. At sea, losses mounted. Destroyers were struck by bombs and torpedoes. Some capsized in minutes. Others burned while still evacuating men. Survivors clung to debris as additional ships maneuvered carefully to avoid collision. Every sinking reduced capacity. Every return voyage became a calculation between speed and exposure. And yet, the numbers began to change. At first, modestly. Hundreds rescued per day. Then thousands. The tally grew slowly, almost suspiciously, as if reality had not yet caught up to expectations. What had begun as a limited extraction started to resemble something larger, something improbable, a rescue. German air attacks intensified as the scale of the evacuation became undeniable. Stuka dive bombers descended with mechanical precision, their sirens designed not just to destroy, but to terrorize. The screaming sound became synonymous with incoming death. Anti-aircraft fire responded in constant bursts, sometimes effective, often too late. Soldiers learned to recognize aircraft by sound alone. They could distinguish engines before they could see shapes in the sky. Seconds became the difference between diving for cover and being caught in open sand. The beaches became an experiment in restraint. Men did not scatter when bombs fell. They froze, then reformed lines. Losses were absorbed with a numbness bordering on disbelief. Survival depended on collective behavior. One man running could trigger many. Many running would overwhelm boats. Overwhelmed boats would capsize. Fear was not absent. It was contained. Above the beaches, another battle unfolded, one largely invisible to the men waiting below. RAF fighters engaged German aircraft in brutal dogfights over the channel and inland airspace. From the sand, it often appeared that the Royal Air Force was nowhere to be seen. In reality, pilots were intercepting bombers before they reached the coast, sacrificing altitude, fuel, and sometimes their own return to base. That misunderstanding, that feeling of abandonment, would linger long after the war ended. As days passed, the German ground advance remained unexpectedly restrained. The perimeter around Dunkirk held longer than most believed possible. Every additional hour translated directly into lives saved. Historians would later debate why the final blow never fell when it could have. For those boarding the boats, theory did not matter. Only departure. They climbed aboard in silence. They left comrades behind. They crossed the channel, staring at a coastline they assumed they would never see again. When England appeared on the horizon, it did not feel like triumph. There were no victory speeches waiting on the docks. It felt like survival postponed. By the end of the initial phase, expectations had already been shattered. Tens of thousands had been evacuated. The numbers surpassed early projections. What was intended as damage control was becoming one of the largest evacuations in military history. But the operation was not finished. French forces still held the shrinking defensive perimeter. British rearguards remained exposed. And as success became visible, ambition expanded with it. Every additional man saved felt like defiance. Every additional hour increased the risk of catastrophic reversal. Operation Dynamo was no longer simply about extraction. It had become a national gamble, a test of how much risk a country was willing to accept, to prove it would not abandon its own. Every evacuation creates a question: who leaves and who stays? By the time Operation Dynamo gained real momentum, tens of thousands of British soldiers had already crossed the channel. The numbers were rising beyond expectation. What began as a limited extraction was evolving into something few had dared to imagine. Almost miraculous. But miracles demand payment. While disciplined British lines stretched across the beaches, another reality unfolded beyond the shrinking defensive perimeter. French divisions, exhausted, undersupplied, and often outnumbered, were holding the line against advancing German forces. They were not waiting for rescue. They were buying time. This is a dimension the film Dunkirk touches only briefly. The French army, often remembered for the rapid collapse of France in 1940, fought with fierce determination in the final days around the city. Units defended canal lines, rail crossings, urban strongpoints, and improvised barricades built from rubble and overturned vehicles. They understood the equation clearly. Every hour they resisted meant more ships loading men on the beaches. Every delayed German advance translated directly into lives saved. It was not cinematic. There were no grand speeches echoing through ruined streets. No promises of reinforcement. Only the blunt arithmetic of survival. Hold long enough, and others live. As the evacuation accelerated, the defensive perimeter tightened. The Allied ring around Dunkirk contracted daily. Villages changed hands repeatedly. Roads became killing corridors. Ammunition stocks thinned. Communications deteriorated into fragments and static. Some British units were ordered to remain behind as rear guards. They did not misunderstand the order. Their task was not to survive. It was to slow. They fought from hedgerows, from shattered farmhouses, from hastily reinforced intersections. Machine gun nests were carved into debris. Anti-tank guns were positioned with minimal ammunition. Every defensive stand was temporary by design, measured not in territory held, but in minutes gained. On the beaches, the lines continued. Few of the men waiting for evacuation understood precisely who was holding the perimeter for them. Few grasped how dangerously thin that defensive ring had become. They saw only distant smoke columns and heard artillery rolling like distant thunder. But behind that smoke were soldiers calculating the cost of every passing minute. Meanwhile, within the German High Command, debate simmered. The earlier halt order that had paused armored divisions remained controversial, even among German officers. Some argued that a decisive ground assault could crush the pocket entirely. Others insisted that artillery and air power were sufficient, and that tanks risked unnecessary losses in marshy terrain. History would later dissect the decision endlessly. Strategic caution? Overconfidence? Fatal miscalculation? For those defending Dunkirk, the reason was irrelevant. The hesitation, whatever its cause, was oxygen. As British numbers on the beaches began to thin, the moral weight of the operation shifted. Attention turned toward evacuating French forces. This was not an automatic decision. Initial priority had been given to British troops, a reality that strained alliances under unbearable pressure. But abandoning French defenders after they had sacrificed so much would have fractured more than diplomacy. It would have shattered trust. So the evacuation widened. French soldiers began boarding ships in growing numbers, often among the last to leave. Some arrived at the beaches after days of combat, uniforms torn, units fragmented, faces blackened with exhaustion. Many did not make it. When the perimeter finally collapsed and German forces entered Dunkirk, thousands of French troops were captured. They had not failed. They had fulfilled their role. The narrative of Dunkirk frequently centers on British resilience, and that resilience was real. But resilience without sacrifice from others would have meant nothing. The success of the evacuation was shared, even if collective memory would later distribute credit unevenly. On the beaches, exhaustion shifted from physical to psychological. Soldiers boarding ships did not cheer. Some wept, not from relief alone, but from disorientation. For days they had prepared themselves for death or capture. Survival felt unreal. Some believed they would be reorganized and sent back to France within weeks. Others feared that invasion of Britain was imminent, that the Channel would soon carry German forces in the opposite direction. Victory was not the dominant emotion. The crossing back to England was not safe passage. German aircraft continued attacking evacuation convoys. Ships burned within sight of safety. Explosions sent men into oil-slicked water, clinging to debris as rescue vessels navigated carefully through fire and wreckage. Even in retreat, war did not pause. And yet, the numbers continued to rise. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. By the end of Operation Dynamo, more than 330,000 Allied soldiers had been evacuated, far beyond the most optimistic early projections. It was not total success. Thousands more captured. An immense quantity of equipment had been abandoned. Tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, ammunition, fuel. The material backbone of an army left behind on French soil. The British Army returned home alive, but nearly disarmed. This is something the film cannot fully illustrate. Dunkirk was not a conventional victory. It was a strategic retreat so vast that survival itself had to be reframed as triumph. Winston Churchill understood the danger in mislabeling it. Wars are not won by evacuations, he reminded Parliament.
Not triumphant.
There would be no illusions that Dunkirk ended the threat. But Churchill also understood something equally powerful. Narrative shapes endurance. If Dunkirk were remembered solely as catastrophe narrowly avoided, morale could fracture. If it were framed as a miracle, national resilience might solidify. Language became strategy. What could have been recorded as humiliation transformed into defiance. The evacuation became proof that Britain would continue fighting, alone if necessary. But for the men who had stood on those beaches, that transformation felt distant from lived reality. They remembered the waiting, the bombing runs, the unnatural silence between attacks, the taste of salt water and smoke. They remembered the men who never boarded ships. They remembered that survival had depended on fragile variables, weather patterns, enemy hesitation, civilian improvisation, and sacrifice measured in minutes. They understood something that history often simplifies. Dunkirk was not a display of overwhelming strength. It was a moment when weakness did not become extinction, and that distinction would shape everything that followed. When the last ships left Dunkirk, the war did not pause. It accelerated. More than 330,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the Channel. On paper, the numbers were staggering. Headlines would soon call it extraordinary. Some would even call it miraculous. But numbers conceal as much as they reveal, because behind those rescued men lay a harsher truth. Britain had saved its army and lost almost everything else. On the beaches of France remained mountains of abandoned equipment, tanks left intact, artillery pieces without crews, endless rows of vehicles, ammunition stockpiles, radios, fuel reserves, medical stations. Entire logistical systems surrendered without formal ceremony. The British Expeditionary Force returned home alive. It did not return ready. The army that stepped onto English soil in June 1940 possessed manpower, but little machinery. Rifles were in short supply. Heavy weapons were gone. Transport capacity had been gutted. Coastal defenses were incomplete. And across the Channel stood an enemy that had conquered Western Europe in weeks. Dunkirk had purchased survival. It had not purchased security. Inside Britain, fear spread with quiet intensity. If France, with its larger army and fortified Maginot Line, could collapse so rapidly, what chance did an isolated island nation truly possess? German forces now controlled ports and airfields along the French coast. The geographic buffer that once separated Britain from continental war had narrowed to a thin strip of water. Kilometers. Nothing more. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain, shifted from speculation to plausible threat. Intelligence suggested preparations were underway. Barges assembled along occupied coasts, aircraft redeployed, troop concentrations adjusted, reconnaissance intensified. For the first time in centuries, Britain faced a realistic prospect of invasion, and it was not ready. This is the part the film Dunkirk does not follow: the uneasy days after survival, when relief dissolved into dread, when celebration was muted by the realization that the enemy had not been defeated. It had only been delayed. British civilians were mobilized with urgency. The Home Guard expanded rapidly, drawing in volunteers too young, too old, or otherwise ineligible for regular service. In some regions, weapon shortages were so severe that drills were conducted with wooden replicas. Shotguns, hunting rifles, improvised explosives. Anything became acceptable. Beaches were fortified with anti-tank obstacles. Barbed wire stretched across likely landing zones. Road signs were removed to confuse potential invaders. Church bells, silent for decades to prevent false alarms, were prepared as signals of invasion. The island braced itself. But ultimately, the decisive barrier would not be on the beaches. It would be in the sky. If Germany achieved air superiority, invasion would follow. If Britain could deny control of the air, Operation Sea Lion would collapse under its own logistical weight. Thus began the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched sustained bombing campaigns targeting airfields, radar installations, aircraft factories, and infrastructure. Waves of bombers crossed the channel daily, escorted by fighters. British pilots, many barely in their 20s, scrambled repeatedly, sometimes multiple times per day. Fuel limits restricted engagement time. Damage accumulated. Losses mounted. They took off knowing that survival depended on precision, timing, and luck. The same fragile elements that had defined Dunkirk. Dunkirk had saved the army. Now the Royal Air Force would determine whether that salvation had meaning. What remains less publicly discussed is how close Britain came to political fracture during this period. Within government circles, voices argued that negotiation might preserve the empire. If invasion appeared inevitable, perhaps compromise could prevent annihilation. Churchill resisted fiercely. But resistance was not unanimous. The memory of Dunkirk influenced every calculation. Had the evacuation failed, Britain would have lacked not only manpower, but morale. Without those rescued soldiers, arguments for negotiation might have prevailed. Because Dunkirk succeeded, the case for endurance gained weight. The phrase Dunkirk spirit began circulating, not as nostalgia, but as strategy. It framed survival under impossible conditions as proof of national resilience. It suggested that improvisation could offset disadvantage, that collapse was not inevitable. Narrative became armor, yet beneath speeches and headlines, anxiety remained constant. German bombers reached London, then Coventry, then other cities. The Blitz transformed night into firelight. Civilians sheltered in underground stations. Entire neighborhoods vanished in single raids. The war was no longer distant artillery over water. It was overhead. And still, invasion never came. Historians continued debating why. Some argue that Hitler underestimated British resolve. Others point to logistical barriers, that amphibious invasion without firm air superiority would have been reckless. The failure of the Luftwaffe to decisively defeat the RAF shifted strategic momentum. But one reality remains clear. If Dunkirk had ended differently, the Battle of Britain might have unfolded from a position of irreversible weakness. The evacuated soldiers became the nucleus of Britain's defensive reorganization. They retrained, re-equipped, integrated into new formations. They carried with them the memory of near destruction and the understanding that survival had been neither guaranteed nor free. Dunkirk reshaped strategy. It hardened political will. It bought time, the rarest currency in war. Time for defenses to strengthen. Time for industry to rearm. Time for alliances to evolve. Within a year, the conflict would expand beyond anything imagined in May 1940. Germany would invade the Soviet Union. The United States would enter the war after Pearl Harbor. The scale of destruction would become global. But in mid-1940, none of that was certain. There was only a narrow channel of water, a partially disarmed army, an island preparing for siege. Dunkirk did not win the war. It did something more subtle. And perhaps more important, it prevented immediate defeat. And in war, preventing collapse can mean the difference between a nation's story ending or continuing long enough to change the world. History rarely preserves events as they were. It reshapes them. It smooths their edges. It reorganizes their chaos. It assigns them meaning. Dunkirk became something larger than the evacuation itself. In the weeks following Operation Dynamo, British newspapers and radio broadcasts began reshaping the narrative. What might have been remembered as catastrophic retreat was reframed as endurance under fire. The word miracle entered public language. And with that single word, memory began to shift. The men who had stood silently on those beaches were no longer symbols of vulnerability. They became embodiments of resilience. The civilian boats that crossed the channel were elevated into legend. The German halt order became a detail, not the central mystery historians would debate for decades. The story simplified. But reality had never been simple. The evacuation succeeded because of fragile circumstances, weather patterns that held, hesitation within German command, improvisation at every level, sacrifice by those who stayed behind. It required men to accept that retreat was the only path to survival. There is no glory in retreat. There is only continuation. The film Dunkirk captures tension with remarkable precision. Its intersecting timelines compress land, sea, and air into a single, escalating experience. It shows fear without melodrama. It avoids grand speeches. It resists overt nationalism. And yet, cinema must always choose its frame. It cannot show every debate behind closed government doors, where lives were weighed against ships, and ships against national survival. It cannot linger on every French unit that held the perimeter, knowing capture was inevitable. It cannot fully convey the anxiety of British civilians staring across the channel, wondering if invasion fleets would appear on the horizon. And it cannot show what followed survival. Because surviving Dunkirk was not enough. The rescued soldiers had to fight again. They had to defend an island under bombardment. They had to re-enter a war that had nearly ended for them. The myth of Dunkirk speaks of courage. The reality of Dunkirk speaks of limitation. In 1940, Britain was not dominant. It was outmaneuvered, outmatched, and nearly erased from continental Europe. What altered the trajectory of history was not overwhelming strength, but refusal to disappear. Dunkirk matters not because it was glorious. It matters because it was incomplete. It left space for the future. History often celebrates decisive victories and crushing defeats. We analyze battles that redraw maps. We commemorate offensives that end wars. But sometimes the most important moments are quieter. Moments when defeat fails to become final. The soldiers who returned to England did not feel like legends. Many felt shame. They had left equipment behind. They had left comrades behind. They had crossed the sea not as conquerors, but as survivors. It would take time and narrative to transform that memory into pride. Yet that transformation mattered, because nations require stories in order to endure. Without narrative, fear fills the vacuum. Dunkirk became a foundational myth for wartime Britain, a reminder that collapse is not destiny, that even in strategic failure, survival can reshape possibility. The evacuation did not guarantee Allied victory. It guaranteed that victory remained possible. And that distinction is everything. If the British Expeditionary Force had been captured in full, Germany would have faced a demoralized island stripped of its professional corps. Negotiation might have seemed pragmatic. Invasion might have appeared inevitable. Instead, the army returned, diminished, but present. and presence changes history. When we look back at Dunkirk today, especially through film, we are drawn to spectacle. The drone of aircraft engines, the expanse of sand, the quiet determination in young faces waiting in line. But beneath those images lies something less cinematic. Dunkirk was proof that survival is sometimes the most radical act available. It was not about defeating the enemy. It was about denying the enemy finality. The war would continue for 5 more years. It would expand into devastation beyond imagination. Cities would burn, millions would die, alliances would shift, empires would collapse. But in May and June of 1940, the future narrowed to a thin line of sand and sea. The soldiers standing there did not know they were positioned at a hinge of history. They knew only that they were waiting. Waiting for ships. Waiting for orders. Waiting to discover whether they would live or be forgotten. Dunkirk ensured they would not be forgotten. Not because it was flawless. Not because it was triumphant. But because it was necessary. History does not always pivot on strength. Sometimes it pivots on survival. And survival, as Dunkirk reminds us, is rarely clean. It is improvised. It is costly. It is uncertain. But when it succeeds, it leaves the door open for everything that follows. History does not end when a battle is lost. It ends when no one remains to continue it. Dunkirk was not the end. It was the refusal to let the end arrive. Every empire faces collapse. Every war reaches its breaking point. But sometimes, at the edge of disaster, a nation steps backward instead of falling forward. And in that step, history continues. Every empire falls. The witness remains. If this story made you see Dunkirk differently, not just as a film, but as a fragile turning point in history, leave a like to support the channel. Subscribe to The Last Witness for more stories that history simplified, but never fully told. And in the comments, tell me, which war film's real story should we uncover next? Because behind every cinematic legend, there is a reality waiting to be examined. And we're just getting started.